could join me once again. We're in session 5 and we're seeing that sin and God's authority. That's what we're going to look at here in this session right now. I'm so glad that you guys could be here. Hopefully you've been following along as we've been going along from Genesis to Revelation, following that gospel thread. And so, like I said, we're in session 5, sin and God's authority. We're going to see how sin drives people to seek greatness for themselves instead of for God's glory. Kind of pointing at myself here, I'm sure it seems like we have a tendency of seeking greatness for ourselves instead of God's glory. And so that's what we'll be looking at today. I'm glad you could join me. You know, there are nearly 7,000 languages spoken around the world today. Did you know that? See, if you ever traveled to a foreign country, you understand how challenging that language barrier can be. I know when we traveled to Thailand to do ministry outreach, thankfully I had my wife who could speak the language, but whenever I was in a situation to try and understand what they were even talking about, I had no idea, so I was really dependent upon my wife in that situation. And so language can be a huge barrier between trying to get something accomplished or as well as just being able to try to understand people. Think about that. Checking into a hotel, ordering a meal, or even finding a bathroom. You know, those are some of the first things you want to find out, is how to say, where's the bathroom, and then be able to get there, right? And so some of these things we communicate on a regular basis in our native language, we don't even really consider them, right? Until we get outside of our comfort zone, we go into another land where they speak a different language and stress levels begin to go high. So, but the reality is even speaking the same language, think about that, sometimes does not eliminate really all that confusion and frustration that comes, right? Even just with some of our texts, sometimes we get confused between what we're trying to say or what certain words, have certain meanings to people. You think about in the United States, a robot is a programmed machine, right, that carries out a task. We understand, hey, this is what a robot is. But in South Africa, they call a traffic light a robot. See, cars in the United States have trunks and hoods, but in other English-speaking nations, they have boots and bonnets. See, what Americans know as ketchup is known as tomato sauce, and when offered a biscuit, in some countries they might receive a cookie, right? So all this frustration over language really goes back to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel. And so that's what we're looking at today. We're going to see how God confuses the languages. However, the story of Babel really is much more than a story about the origin of the language. Even more so, it is really a story about the root cause of sin in the very human heart, that pridefulness, right? And so the Tower of Babel story is filled with people who wanted to honor themselves and to show their skills rather than really seeking to glorify God. How many times do we do that? We don't take the skills that God has given us and use them in a way to glorify God. We always seem to want to receive that glorification for ourselves, right? For those things we accomplish, as opposed to saying, hey, God deserves all the glory. That's why I have a lot of respect for some of those athletes who will, when they do well, they're not pointing to themselves, they're pointing to the Lord Jesus Christ, recognizing the skill, the talent, everything that they have has been given to them by God. So what we're going to see here is the Tower of Babel is filled with people who wanted to honor themselves and to show their skills rather than glorifying God. So what they were doing is they were living in rebellion, wanting to make a name for themselves instead of seeking to glorify God. You and I glorify God with the gifts and the talents that we've been given. That's what we should do. We should take these gifts and these talents that God has given us and seek to glorify Him by doing what? Serving others, by helping others. Not when we only use them to help ourselves, because when we do that, what we're doing is we're making a name for ourselves. That's why I was given that analogy of sports fans, because a lot of times it's like, hey man, look how awesome, how great I am. And the reality is the only reason that you're awesome or even have any of that talent or even the ability to even walk or even to do those things is because of God. And so you need to be able to be willing to acknowledge that. And so what we're going to see at this point in Genesis, as we're talking about the Tower of Babel, this takes place quite a while after the judgment of mercy of the flood, right? We discussed in the previous session, last session, we looked at how God brings judgment. Not only does He say He's going to judge, but He did bring judgment, and then He saved that one family, Noah's family. That's what we discussed in the last session. However, after the flood, humanity really didn't get any better, right? It was broken from the inside out. There was still a sin problem because there was still a heart problem. See, sin remained in people's heart after the flood, and so God knew this was true. See, the flood was only meant to slow down the progression of sin in the world, because the truth is we were born with the sin nature because of Adam. It's not like we can remove that sin out of our life. The problem is we have that sin problem. That's why the Lord Jesus Christ came to remove that sin from us. Not that it would be removed from us, but when we place our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, we receive his righteousness. See, just as we've received the sin from Adam, by faith we receive the righteousness of Christ, so that we can begin then to walk in a way that is pleasing to the Lord. Doesn't mean that we are perfectly righteous and holy, but we have the righteousness of Christ. And so when he returns, we will be in his kingdom forever, and we will be without sin. And that's the day that I look forward to. I hope you do as well. And so sin remained in people's heart even after the flood. See, God knew this was true, and so the flood was only meant to slow down really the progression of the sin that was in the world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. And like I've said before, I'm reading from the English Standard Version, ESV. And so we're going to read chapter 11 of Genesis. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Wow. I don't know about you, but at times I'm like, man, I wish we all spoke the same language. It feels like we could get a lot of things accomplished, right? And as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the very land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. See, they wanted to make a name for themselves. See, this tragic event occurred on the very plains of Shinar, which is really modern-day Iraq, for some of those of you who are wondering. And so we need to notice that immediately the people were disregarding basically God's specific commandment, right? God had first told Adam and Eve to be fruitful and to multiply and fill the earth. And we see after the flood, he gave that very same command to Noah and the descendants. See, not only to be fruitful and to multiply, but to then fill the earth, not to be in one specific place, but to fill the earth. And so this is a commandment that God has given, to Adam and Eve, and then it continued on through Noah and his descendants. See, God's intent for his name was to be glorified as people filled the creation. See, we're his reflecting agents, and so we're supposed to fill the world, and we're supposed to reflect him in and through our lives. But instead, people wanted to build the city, and they wanted to build a tower for what their glory and to exalt their name, specifically so they wouldn't be scattered throughout the earth. See, you and I, we have a tendency of doing that, right? It's all about building up our kingdom and exalting ourselves, as opposed to glorifying God and seeking to do those things that bring glory to his name, seeking to advance his kingdom. See, the truth is, God isn't against cities and towers, of course, but the architecture itself wasn't the issue that day. See? It was what was behind the city and the tower. It was the wayward hearts of humanity. The people wanted to build a city with the tower so high, right? They said that it would reach to the heavens, that they would make a name for themselves. It was about seeking to glorify themselves. See, feel the arrogance in that statement, right? That's what they were doing. They're being very arrogant in that. See, their sin was an attempt to reach for God in its own really warped way, if you think about it. That's why the text says that they wanted to build a tower with its tops to the heavens or to the sky. In my version here, it did say sky, or I said heaven. Again, some versions say sky. And really, the Hebrew word for that word is actually heaven. See, they were trying to get back the belongings, the security, and the greatness that they had in God. See, even the name for this tower, think about it, Babel, or Babylon, literally means the gate of God. That's what it means. But see, the problem of sin isn't necessarily that we want belonging, that we want security or even greatness, but that we look for other qualities in the wrong places. See that? We look outside of where we should find the greatest quality, the greatest purpose, the greatest satisfaction is in our relationship with God. See, we look to small things like fame or achievement to fill God-sized voids in our heart, when God is the one that should be filling that void in our heart. See, God wants first place in our life, and anytime we go outside of that, we're going against God and his purpose for why he's created us. See, that's why there's so much brokenness, because we're trying to find ourselves in other things as opposed to finding ourselves in God and our purpose. And so we end up being broken through that, trying to find fulfillment in anything outside of God's perfect will for our lives. See, they wanted to achieve greatness for themselves. Notice in the last line of verse 4 that they're acting directly against God's good command to fill the earth. Why? Because it says they wanted to huddle together and to build their own kingdom. See, God didn't say stay in one place. He said be fruitful and multiply, right? And to fill the earth. And so here we see God's providence come into play. See, because God is providential. And what is providence? Well, providence refers to God's continuing work and very involvement in his creation. God is continuously at work. See, this includes God's preservation of the created order, his governance, and his very care for his people. And as Christians, we believe the entire universe is contingent upon God. It means we're dependent upon God. See, God isn't contingent. He's not contingent upon the world. He's not contingent upon anything. But see, as Christians, we recognize and understand that God is in control of all things. He not only created all things, but he sustains all things. So the whole entire universe is contingent upon God, incapable of existing apart from him. And the other thing is we also believe God's personal and direct intervention in the world, which affects the natural order and the individual events within human history. See, the truth is God is involved with our everyday life and with every detail. See, it's not a hands-off approach. Some people might think, well, God is this distant God, this transcending God that is not involved in their life, but that is not so. God is involved in the very little details of our life, which makes it so amazing. Because God cares about those little details in our life. You know, we think, oh, God was able to part the Red Sea, he's able to breathe everything and speak it into existence. But little do we know, God is involved in those little intricate details of our life. We have a very intricate, detailed God who is involved with our life. See, we need to realize that though God may not be contingent to his created world, in other words, he's not contingent upon this world. He's not contingent upon anything. He sustains himself. He's not dependent upon anything or anyone else. But just because he's not contingent upon this world or anything in this world, that doesn't mean he isn't involved. That is because God is both transcending and immanent. See, or you can think of the word immanence. See, the word transcendence, the transcendent of God means that God exists outside of space and outside of time. And then you've got the immanence of God, which means God is present within space and time. You're like, wait a minute, is that some sort of a paradox? Or I mean, how does that work? See, these are both attributes of God in that he is both nearby and far away. It's one of those paradoxes of God, see, that he's both near and yet far away. So he is both transcendent and immanent. Means he's present. It means he's involved. That's what the providential says. He's involved in what's going on with what in our world. See, the true wickedness of sin doesn't begin with an immoral act. It actually begins with the heart behind it. See, that's why the rebellion of Babel became a picture of mankind's worst wickedness. See, it certainly didn't look at all that bad back on the plains of Shinar, but the root was there. A persistent and powerful root called pride. That's the very first, you think about in the very beginning, Adam and Eve, that was a pride thing. That's the root of our sin, typically. The root of it is pride, even though it comes out in other things. See, in that pride, it's our heart that says, I will, instead of God's will. See, when Satan was kicked out of heaven, it wasn't because of sex or violence. It was because of pride, right? That's why he was kicked out. Pride seems to be the very root of our sin, like I was saying. And so we're going to move on now to the next verses in chapter 11 of Genesis, verses 5 through 9. And it says, And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. See, he's saying there's more that they will do. In other words, as they seek to work together. But what they're going to do is not going to be a good thing. It's going against God's perfect purpose for their lives. And so, what does it continue on to say? And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. See, he's saying that they can come together and be able to do these things. In other words, exalt themselves, to put themselves above God, to forget about God. Come, let us go down and there and let us, and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. So they left, just kind of standing there. They were done building. Can you imagine? Pass me the brick, all of a sudden, what are you talking about? Amazing to think how that happens. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the languages of all the earth. They began to babble, right? All from there, the Lord dispersed them over the face of the earth. See, God had to come down to see the human's grand innovation. In other words, this tower was only a speck in comparison to God's greatness. See, God didn't judge the people in Shinar because he was threatened by their actions, no, but because he cared deeply about their hearts. He knew their hearts were wandering away from them, and without them being left alone, they would continue to move farther and farther away from God. See, that's the issue. See, God is not threatened by our rebellion against him, but that does not mean that he will ignore our sin. God is jealous over his glory and will not. Genesis 11, 5 through 9, where it talked about how God had come down to the human's grand initiative. And in other words, this tower was only a speck in comparison to God's greatness. We're going to see that God didn't judge the people in Shinar because he was threatened by their actions, but because he cared deeply about their hearts. See, God is not threatened by our rebellious heart or the fact that we're rebelling against him, but that doesn't mean he'll ignore our sin. As we looked before, we see that God does bring judgment. See, he's not going to ignore our sins because God is jealous for his glory, and he will not allow anything to distract from it. See, God is a jealous God, and sometimes people see jealousy as a bad thing, but God, in a sense, is jealous because he created us for us, and he loves us, and he wants us to love him, because when we're loving him and following him, it's what's best for us. And see, he knows what's best for us. And so this is why God puts an end to every kingdom that is not his, one way or another. So what does God do? God puts an end to the very building of the tower by confusing the people's language. See, he could have destroyed the tower, right? He could have struck the building with lightning and the builders and caused a massive earthquake, anything like that. Instead, what does he do? He confused their language so that their progress was stunted. See, what he wanted to do is he wanted to slow the spread of sin. Humanity's unified language would have led further and further to rebellion against God. See, if it's left unchecked, they're going to continue in that. It's going to continue to grow. So God needed to slow them down by confusing their language and spoiling their plans. We have to be careful because we too can be tempted to build up our treasures in a way that communicates to the very world around us that this is where we find our identity. Our identity is finding these things that we do that are outside of God. We find our identity in our joy and in our life. See, the very temptation is to make a name for ourselves, which leads us to believe we are the very center of the universe. And we can accomplish, let's say, even salvation for ourselves. See, that's the greatest problem that we have, is we have a tendency to think that we're our own gods, that we're in control of our own lives, and that we can live the way that we want to live. And that we can maybe even accomplish salvation on our own. We can work our way up to heaven. We can be like God. You think of Adam and Eve. They wanted to be like God. Or so we think. See, many of us seem to think that the Tower of Babel story ends with God destroying the tower, but it doesn't. See, that's what they would think. They would think, he would just destroy the tower, but God left the tower there. And that's incredibly significant. Why? See, even after causing the people's plans to fail, what did God do? God left the Tower of Babel gradually decaying and just standing there as a monument for what? A monument to the human's rebellion against God, a warning about the very final destination of sin. See, God often does that for us. See, he frustrates our sinful plans, but instead of just, crushing those plans completely, he'll leave those broken towers there. See, we'd rather have him clean up the mess so we don't have to see it anymore, right? We can see, that's where we failed. But he leaves it so we'll remember his grace and our inability to find joy and meaning and purpose apart from him. See, it's good news that God causes idolatrous plans to fail, because time after time, the God who is committed to our good, the God who wants us to find our satisfaction in him, what's he going to do? He will slowly, in other words, strip away everything else in which we try to find joy. Not because he's a joy kill, but because those things lead us farther away from God, and it leads us in the wrong direction. We need to be drawing closer to God. And so he'll slowly strip away everything else that we try to find joy in, so that we will turn to him. And we'll find true joy and true purpose that he has for our lives, because he truly knows what is best for us. He wants what's best for us. See, God created us for his purposes, so he knows exactly what we were meant to be doing. Worshiping Him, following Him, glorifying Him. Because it's all about Him. He is the creator and sustainer of life. He's the one who has given us life. But the amazing thing is, He has demonstrated towards us, because His commitment towards us, how much He actually loves us, and how much He is committed to us, and how much value we have because of who He is. And so what we see in this story is an element of mercy in this very act of judgment. It seems to have been the very theme that we've seen, right, again and again in Genesis. Think about Genesis 3, right? Because Adam and Eve sinned, they were judged and banished from paradise. But was this action only judgment? No, it wasn't just judgment. See, God could have annihilated Adam and Eve right then and there and started all over again, but He showed them mercy. He sacrificed an animal in order to clothe them. So He promised that a Messiah would be born through that seed, the seed of Eve, and would crush the serpent. Genesis 4, which we really didn't cover, where you have Cain killing Abel. Cain was judged and forced to wander. Even here, God showed him an element of mercy, because Cain expressed his fear of being killed in vengeance. Hey, they're going to kill me in vengeance. But God placed upon him a mark of protection. See, when the state of humanity was described as creating new evils, with every thought and intent, God brought judgment. See, Genesis 6 through 9 talks about that as you read through there. And we just got done doing that with the flood in the previous session. See, when the state of humanity was described as creating new evils, remember, every thought and every intent of the heart was evil continuously? What does God do? He brought judgment. How did He bring that judgment? Through the flood. But it wasn't just judgment. He actually saved, right, a remnant of humanity in the ark, Noah and his family. And God continues to show us mercy to His children even today. We have a merciful God. See, God disciplines us when we sin, because that is what's good for us. Discipline is good because it's what proves to us that we're actually His. And it tells us that in Hebrews. If you go to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 through 11. It says right here, chapter 12 of Hebrews, verses 5 through 11. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by Him. For the Lord disciplines the one who He loves. You hear that? He disciplines the ones He loves. He chastises every son whom He receives. It is for the discipline that you have to endure. See, God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. See, by being disciplined, that is demonstrating towards us that He does love us, that we are His sons, and that He cares about us. Verse 9, besides this, we have earthly father who disciplined us, and we respect them. Right? As fathers, we discipline our children because we know what's best for them. They don't know. And we do want what's best for them. And because we love them. If we're not disciplining them, we need to understand, take a look at our hearts and say, wow, do I really even love my son or my daughter? If I'm not disciplining them, I'm letting them do what they want to do, which leads to destruction. And so He's just saying, hey, earthly fathers disciplined their sons, and the sons respected them. Shall we not much more be subjected to the Father in heaven, of course, of spirits and life? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best for them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful, right? Rather than pleasant. It is. It seems painful. It's not pleasant. But later it yields peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained up by it. See, we're needing to be trained up by it. See, God is disciplined because it's what proves He loves us, and He wants us to be disciplined by that. See, the discipline is merciful because it produces the fruit of peace and righteousness, even if it isn't enjoyable at the time, because no discipline is enjoyable at the time. But it's developing us, it's growing us, it's maturing us. It's helping us to recognize and realize that we are dependent upon God for everything. See, we have to remember that any one moment in our lives, we are working on one of these two towers. See, we're either pursuing God's will or our own. His mission or ours. We're either hoarding possessions as our own, or we're gratefully leveraging what God has given us as His good stewards to proclaim His gospel. You see that? We need to take what God has given us and seek to advance His kingdom and seek to bring glory to His name. I know with my own ministry, that's what I try and continue to be focused on as I'm out there reaching children and inviting the churches to come and to be a part of sharing the gospel in the community, that it's about exalting and magnifying and proclaiming the name of Christ. His name needs to be exalted. His name needs to be known. And it's not about my ministry. It's not about me. It's about proclaiming the kingdom of God for the glory of God. And so we need to take what God has given us, whether it's our times, our talents, or our treasures, and leverage those as God's good stewards for His glory. See, one day God will gather His people who are scattered around the world to worship Him together. Talks about that in Revelations. From every tribe, tongue, and nation will be together worshiping the Lord. Together. So let me ask you, what tower are you building as you wait for that day? Is it your own, or is it God's? Is it for His glory? Are you seeking to advance His mission and bring glory to His name? Or are you seeking to bring glory to your own name? So that's a good question, right? You got to say, am I advancing God's kingdom? Or am I seeking to advance and glorify my own kingdom? Got to be careful, because that sin nature can draw us away from really doing what Christ has called us to do and allow it to become for ourselves. Listen, sin drives people to seek greatness for themselves instead of for God's glory. That's what we talked about today in this session. Next session, we're going to see suffering and God's presence. And we'll see that God draws near to comfort us when we suffer. That's right. Well, thank you for joining me and for the gospel thread. And hey, we're going to see you next time. So have a great day. God bless.